The wind screamed through the Sierra Nevada mountains with such ferocity that Silas Preston could barely see 3 feet beyond his cabin window, but he heard them anyway, the distant, desperate jingle of sleigh bells cutting through the howling December storm like a prayer made of silver and ice. He stood motionless for a moment, his massive frame silhouetted against the firelight, listening. Most men would have convinced themselves they had imagined it, that the wind was playing tricks. But Silas had lived alone on this mountain for 6 years, and he knew every sound the wilderness made. This was different. This was human desperation translated into the frantic rhythm of bells that should have been moving but had gone still. Without hesitation, he reached for his bearskin coat and pulled on his heavy boots. The cold hit him like a physical blow when he opened the cabin door, but he had long since made peace with the mountain's brutality. At 30 years old, his body had adapted to this harsh existence: broad shoulders that could haul a full-grown elk, arms thick with muscle from splitting wood and wrestling with nature itself, and a chest that seemed carved from the same granite that made up these peaks. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, wild and unbound, and his beard was full but trimmed close enough to see the strong line of his jaw. He grabbed his lantern and lit it with practiced efficiency, then stepped into the blizzard that had been raging since nightfall. The snow was already knee-deep and showed no signs of stopping. He held the lantern high and listened again. They're fainter now, but definitely bells. They had a quality of stillness to them that made his gut clench. Something had gone wrong out there. Silas moved through the snow with the confidence of a man who had navigated these mountains in every season and every mood they possessed. The wind tried to push him back, but he lowered his head and pressed forward, following the sound that most people would never have heard over the storm's rage. His cabin sat on a ridge that overlooked the only pass-through road for 20 miles in any direction. It was a lonely stretch that saw little traffic, especially this late in December of 1876. Anyone foolish enough to travel through during a storm like this was either desperate or ignorant of what the mountains could do. The bells had fallen completely silent now, which only made him move faster. Half a mile from his cabin, just where the road curved around a steep embankment, he found her. The sleigh had overturned completely, one runner pointing up toward the furious sky like an accusation. The horse was down in the snow, struggling against its harness with wild, panicked movements. And there, partially thrown from the wreckage, lay a woman in a dark traveling cloak that was already being buried by the relentless snowfall. Silas reached her in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside her. He set the lantern down and carefully turned her over, brushing the snow from her face. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features that seemed impossibly fragile against the mountain's harshness. Her skin was pale, her lips starting to take on that dangerous blue tinge that meant the cold was already winning. But she was breathing, and when he touched her cheek, she moaned softly. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke aloud anymore, having no one but himself for company most days. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. That was answer enough. He needed to get her warm and fast. First, though, he had to deal with the horse. The animal was working itself into a lather, and in this cold that would kill it as surely as a bullet. Silas moved to the struggling creature and spoke in low, soothing tones as he worked to free it from the tangled harness. His hands moved with surprising gentleness for their size, and within minutes he had the horse on its feet. It was a decent animal, a bay mare with intelligent eyes that calmed under his touch. He tied her to a nearby tree where she would have some shelter from the wind. Then he returned to the woman. She was curled on her side now, an instinctive attempt to conserve warmth, but it would not be enough. He gathered her into his arms as carefully as if she were made of porcelain, noting with concern how light she felt, how her entire body was beginning to shiver. That was good, it meant her body was still fighting. He tucked her against his chest, using his own bulk to shield her from the worst of the wind, and began the trek back to his cabin. The journey that had taken him perhaps 10 minutes on the way out felt like an eternity on the return. The woman in his arms had gone still again, which worried him more than the shivering had. He talked to her as he walked, telling her to hold on. That warmth was coming, that she was safe now. He did not know if she could hear him, but it seemed important to try. When his cabin finally materialized out of the swirling white chaos, relief flooded through him. He kicked the door open and carried her directly to the fireplace, where the flames still danced merrily, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded outside. He laid her on the thick bearskin rug that covered the floor near the hearth and quickly set about building up the fire. Once the flames were roaring, he turned his attention back to her. Her clothes were soaked through with snow, and he knew he had to get them off her or the wet fabric would continue to leach heat from her body. He worked quickly and clinically, removing her cloak, her traveling dress, her layers of petticoats that seemed designed more for propriety than practicality. He left her in her undergarments and wrapped her in every blanket and fur he possessed, then positioned her as close to the fire as he dared. Her shivering returned with a vengeance, her whole body convulsing with it. Silas had seen this before. It was the body's desperate attempt to generate warmth. He grabbed his kettle and hung it over the fire to heat water for tea, then knelt beside her again and began rubbing her hands and feet, trying to encourage circulation without causing damage to skin that had gotten too cold. "Come on," he murmured, working his thumbs in circles over her palms. "Stay with me. You are going to be fine. You just need to fight a little longer." Her eyes opened then, just a crack at first, then wider. They were the most remarkable shade of green he had ever seen, like spring grass or new leaves, completely out of place in this winter world. They focused on him with obvious confusion, and he saw fear flash through them. "Who?" she started, but her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely form words. "My name is Silas," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I heard your bells and found you on the road, your sleigh overturned. You are in my cabin now. You are safe." She tried to speak again, but could not manage it through the violent shivers that racked her frame. He reached for one of the blankets and tucked it more securely around her shoulders. "Do not try to talk yet," he said. "Just focus on getting warm. I am making tea. Can you tell me your name?" "Tea Tabitha," she managed through clicking teeth. "Tabitha V. Vaughn." "Tabitha," he repeated, and something about the name felt right, like it fit her delicate features and those startling green eyes. "Well, Tabitha, you gave me quite a scare out there. What in God's name were you doing traveling through a mountain pass in the middle of a blizzard?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she had lost consciousness again. But then she whispered, Had to get to Lone Pine. My sister." "Lone Pine is still 15 miles from here," Silas said, frowning. "And in this storm it might as well be on the moon. You are not going anywhere tonight, or probably for several days if this weather keeps up." Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, though he could not tell if they were from pain, fear, or frustration. Probably all three. He felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward this stranger who had quite literally crashed into his solitary existence. The kettle began to whistle, and he rose to prepare the tea. He added honey and a touch of whiskey to it, then helped her sit up enough to drink. She clutched the warm cup between her shaking hands and sipped gratefully, the color slowly beginning to return to her face. Silas settled onto the floor beside her, his back against one of the rough-hewn chairs that served as his furniture. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, he found himself studying her more carefully. Even in her bedraggled state, wrapped in furs with her dark hair tangled and damp, she was beautiful. It was not just her face, which was certainly lovely enough, but something in the set of her jaw and the directness of those green eyes suggested a strength of will that he had not expected. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice still shaky but stronger than before. "You saved my life. The mountain can be cruel to those who do not respect it," he replied simply, "though I suspect you did not venture out in this storm by choice." She shook her head, taking another sip of tea. "I was staying in a boarding house in Independence, trying to wait out the weather, but I received word that my sister was gravely ill in Lone Pine. The fever, they said she might not survive. I could not just sit there and do nothing. So you hired a sleigh and a driver to take you through the pass," Silas concluded. "The driver?" Tabitha's eyes widened with sudden horror. "Where is he? Was he with the sleigh, is he?" "There was no one else," Silas said quietly. "Just you and the horse." Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh no. He must have. When the sleigh started to tip, I remember him jumping clear. He shouted that he would go for help. But in this storm, they both knew what that meant. A man on foot in a blizzard like this, even if he had managed to avoid injury in the jump, would not last long." Silas rose and moved to the window, peering out into the white darkness. He could go out again, search for the driver, but he knew with grim certainty that it would be futile. The man had made his choice when he abandoned his passenger. "I can look in the morning," he said, though he held out little hope. "Once there is light, and if the storm breaks." Tabitha had gone very quiet behind him. When he turned, he saw that she was crying in earnest now, silent tears streaming down her face. "This is all my fault," she whispered. "He only took the job because I offered him double his usual rate. And now he is out there, probably frozen to death, and I am here by your fire and my sister." Silas crossed back to her and crouched down so he could look her in the eye. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "None of this is your fault. The man who took you into that storm made a choice, likely a greedy one, if he was willing to risk both your lives for double pay. And when things went wrong, he made another choice to save himself. You cannot carry guilt for other people's decisions. But my sister will either recover or she will not, and you being there or not being there will not change what fever decides to do." He said softer now. "I know that is a hard truth, but it is truth nonetheless. Right now, you need to focus on your own recovery. You were minutes away from freezing to death out there." She stared at him for a long moment, those green eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether she could trust this rough stranger who had materialized out of the storm. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "I am sorry," she said. "You live all the way out here, obviously preferring your solitude, and now you are stuck with a weeping woman in your home." "I have had worse company," Silas said, and was surprised to find himself almost smiling. "Once had a wounded wolverine take up residence under my porch for 3 weeks. You are a significant improvement over that situation." That earned him a watery laugh, and something in his chest loosened at the sound. He stood and moved to his small kitchen area, little more than a shelf and a work table, and began pulling out ingredients. "You need food," he announced. "Something warm and substantial. I have venison stew from yesterday that just needs heating." As he busied himself with the simple task of preparing a meal, he was acutely aware of her watching him from her nest of blankets by the fire. His cabin was small, just one large room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom, with a separate small storage room attached to the back. It was built solidly, designed to withstand the mountain winters, with thick log walls and a sturdy roof. Animal pelts hung from hooks on the walls, both for insulation and because he sold them once or twice a year when he made the trek down to town. It was a rough, masculine space that had not seen a woman's presence in all the years he had lived here. "How long have you been up here?" Tabitha asked, as if reading his thoughts. 6 years, he replied, stirring the pot of stew. "Came up after the war ended. I had my fill of people and civilization for a while." "The war," she repeated softly. "You fought?" "For the Union, 3 years." He did not elaborate, and something in his tone must have communicated that he did not wish to. She was perceptive enough not to press. Instead, she asked, "And you have been alone up here all this time?" "Mostly. I go into town a few times a year to trade pelts and supplies. Sometimes prospectors pass through, or hunters. But for the most part, yes, it is just me and the mountain." "That sounds lonely." Silas paused in his stirring. Considering her words, "It can be," he admitted, "but it can also be peaceful. The mountain demands much, but it does not lie or deceive. It is honest in its harshness. I found I valued that after years of seeing what men can do to each other." He brought her a bowl of stew and a spoon, along with some bread that was a day old but still good. She accepted it with obvious gratitude and ate with an appetite that pleased him. Good, she needed to rebuild her strength. As she ate, Silas returned to the fire and added another log. The storm showed no signs of abating outside, the wind still howling like a living thing. They were completely cut off from the rest of the world, isolated in this small pocket of warmth and firelight. It was a strange intimacy, being trapped here with this woman he had known for less than an hour. "What will you do?" he asked. "Once the storm passes, I mean." Tabitha finished chewing and swallowed before answering. "I have to get to Lone Pine. I have to know. I have to see my sister. After that, I suppose it depends on what I find when I get there." "You have no husband?" "No family expecting you back in Independence." She shook her head. "No husband. My parents died 2 years ago, influenza. There is just my sister Margaret and me now. She moved to Lone Pine last spring when she married a man who works at the sawmill there. I stayed in Independence because I had a position as a school teacher." Her voice caught slightly. "Had. I suppose I no longer have that position. Since I left in the middle of the term, they would dismiss you for going to a sick sister." "The headmaster is not known for his compassion," she said with a bitter smile. "But it does not matter. Margaret needed me, and that was more important than any position." Silas found himself admiring her fierce loyalty, even as he recognized the impracticality of it. "You gave up your livelihood to rush to her side in the middle of a blizzard. That is love or foolishness, and I am not entirely sure which." "Perhaps both," Tabitha acknowledged. She had finished the stew and set the bowl aside, pulling the blankets more tightly around herself. The shivers had finally stopped and proper color had returned to her face. She was going to be fine, he realized with relief. The mountain had not claimed her after all. "You should rest," he said, rising to take her empty bowl. "You have been through an ordeal and your body needs sleep to recover." "Where will I sleep?" she asked, glancing around the single-room cabin. "You will take the bed," Silas said, gesturing to the sturdy frame in the corner that held his mattress and more furs. "I will make myself comfortable by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," she protested. "You have already done so much." "You will take the bed," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I have slept in far worse places than a warm floor by a fire. It will be no hardship." She looked like she wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was clearly winning out. He helped her stand, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow as she swayed slightly, and guided her to the bed. She sank onto it gratefully, and he pulled the blankets up over her. "Thank you, Silas," she murmured, her eyes already drifting closed. "For everything." He stood there for a moment, looking down at her delicate face framed by the dark curtain of her hair spread across his pillow. Something had shifted in his carefully ordered world, some fundamental change that he could not quite name. This woman had literally crashed into his life, and he had a feeling that nothing would be quite the same after she left. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight he would simply be grateful that he had heard those bells in time. The storm raged for 3 days without pause, howling around the cabin like some vengeful spirit determined to bury them in snow. Silas had weathered many such storms in his years on the mountain, but never before with company, and certainly never with a woman whose presence seemed to fill every corner of his small space. Tabitha proved to be a remarkably resilient guest. By the morning after her rescue, she was up and moving around, insisting on helping with tasks despite Silas's protests that she should rest. She was restless with worry about her sister, he knew, and needed something to occupy her hands and mind. So he let her help him prepare meals, and she proved surprisingly capable at the hearth, revealing that she had done plenty of cooking before her days as a schoolteacher. They fell into an easy rhythm, sharing the tasks of daily survival that the mountain demanded. She would tend the fire while he went out into the storm to check on the horse he had stabled in his small lean-to, or to bring in more firewood from the covered pile he maintained. She mended a tear in one of his shirts without being asked, her needle moving with practiced efficiency, and he responded by fashioning her a pair of proper winter moccasins from spare leather, since her traveling shoes were completely inadequate for the snow. But it was the talking that surprised him most. Silas had grown accustomed to silence, to days passing without hearing his own voice except to occasionally speak to the mountain itself. Now, he found himself drawn into long conversations with Tabitha that ranged from the trivial to the profound. She asked him about life on the mountain, about the animals he hunted and trapped, about how he had learned to survive in such isolation. He found himself telling her things he had not spoken of in years, about growing up on a farm in Pennsylvania, about the horrors of the war that had driven him to seek this solitude, about the strange peace he had found in testing himself against nature's indifference. In turn, she told him about her life in independence, about the children she had taught, and the satisfaction she found in watching young minds open to new ideas. She spoke of her parents with obvious love, and of how their deaths had forced her to take on responsibilities she had never imagined. She described her sister Margaret with a mixture of affection and exasperation, painting a picture of a younger woman who was perhaps more romantic and impulsive than practical. She met her husband Thomas at a barn dance, Tabitha recounted on the second evening, as they sat by the fire after supper. They knew each other for exactly 3 weeks before he proposed. I tried to counsel her to wait, to take more time to be certain, but she was convinced he was her destiny. She smiled sadly. Perhaps she was right. I hope she has been happy with him. You said you have no husband, Silas observed, feeding another log to the flames. Is that by choice or circumstance? Tabitha was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. A bit of both, I suppose. I have had offers over the years, but I always found myself unable to accept them. There was always some reason the timing was wrong, or the gentleman in question seemed more interested in securing a housekeeper than a true partner, or, she trailed off, then shrugged. Or perhaps I simply had not met anyone who made my heart feel like it might burst from my chest, the way Margaret described feeling about Thomas. And you wanted that feeling, Silas said. It was not a question. Is that foolish? She asked, turning those green eyes on him. To want love like the poets describe it, rather than just accepting a practical arrangement? No, he said quietly. I do not think that is foolish at all. The air between them felt suddenly charged with something unspoken, and Silas found himself acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the way the firelight painted gold across her features. He cleared his throat and stood, needing distance and the clarity it might bring. I should check the storm, he said, moving to the window. The wind had died down slightly, he noted with relief. If this trend continued, they might be able to attempt the journey to Lone Pine in another day or two. The thought should have pleased him. Instead, he found himself oddly reluctant to consider the end of this strange interlude, this unexpected companionship that had awakened parts of himself he thought he had left behind when he climbed into these mountains. By the third day, Tabitha's worry about her sister had grown to nearly unbearable levels. Silas watched her pace the small confines of the cabin like a caged animal, wringing her hands and starting at every sound, as if she might somehow hear news from 15 miles away through walls and wind and snow. I feel so helpless, she confessed that afternoon, pressing her forehead against the cold window glass. Just sitting here while she might need me. Silas came to stand beside her, looking out at the landscape that was beginning to emerge from the storm's white fury. The wind had finally died to almost nothing, and though snow still fell, it was the gentle, tired snow of a storm exhausting itself rather than the vicious horizontal assault of the previous days. The storm is breaking, he said. By morning, if the weather holds, we can make the attempt to get you to Lone Pine. She turned to him with such hope in her eyes that it made his chest ache. Truly, I give you my word, he promised. I will get you to your sister. The relief that flooded her face was profound, and without thinking she threw her arms around him in a spontaneous embrace. Thank you, she whispered against his shoulder. Thank you, Silas. He stood rigid for a moment, shocked by the sudden contact, by the feel of her in his arms. It had been so long since he had held another person, since he had felt the warmth of human affection. His hands came up slowly to rest against her back, and he let himself have this moment, this brief connection that meant more than he wanted to examine. When she pulled back, there was a flush in her cheeks that he did not think came entirely from the fire's warmth. I apologize, she said quickly. That was forward of me. No apology necessary, he assured her, his voice rougher than usual. You have been under tremendous strain. They spent the rest of the evening in preparation for the journey. Silas checked and rechecked his supplies, ensuring he had enough provisions for the trek and, if necessary, for an extended stay in Lone Pine should the weather turn again. He fashioned a travois that the horse could pull, something more stable than trying to right the overturned sleigh, and fitted it with the furs and blankets that would keep Tabitha warm during the journey. As darkness fell and they settled in for what would be their last night sharing the cabin, Silas found himself unexpectedly melancholy. Over these 3 days he had grown accustomed to her presence, to the sound of her voice and the sight of her moving about his space. The cabin would feel empty once she was gone, emptier than it ever had during all his years of solitude. Silas, Tabitha said softly from where she sat on the edge of the bed. May I ask you something? Of course. When you take me to Lone Pine tomorrow, will you stay? At least for a little while. She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. I realize I have no right to ask anything more of you. You have already saved my life and given me shelter, and I am a stranger who disrupted your peace. But what? He prompted gently. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw a vulnerability that made something in his carefully guarded heart crack open. But I find I am not ready to say goodbye to you, not yet. The confession hung in the air between them, honest and brave and terrifying in its implications. Silas crossed the room slowly and sat beside her on the bed, their shoulders nearly touching. I am not ready either, he admitted, the words feeling like they were being pulled from somewhere deep inside him. These past few days you have reminded me of things I thought I had left behind, things I thought I no longer needed or wanted. What things? She whispered. Connection, he said simply. Companionship. The sound of laughter in my home. The feeling that someone might care whether I come back from checking my traps in the morning. He turned to face her fully. You have reminded me that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing, and that I may have been confusing one for the other for quite some time. Tabitha reached out and took his hand, her fingers small and delicate against his calloused palm. Then stay, she said. Stay in Lone Pine, at least for a few days. Let us see what this is between us. I know we have only known each other for 3 days, but it feels like so much more than that. Is that insane? If it is, then we are both afflicted with the same madness, Silas replied. He lifted his free hand and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, marveling at the softness of it. Tabitha, I need you to understand something. I am not an easy man. The war changed me in ways I cannot fully explain. I came to this mountain because people and their complexities exhausted me. I have nothing to offer you except rough hands and a rougher life. You have more to offer than you know, she said firmly. You are kind and brave and honorable. You saved my life without a second thought. You have been respectful and gentle with me even though we are complete strangers trapped alone together. You have listened to me talk about my worries and fears and have not once dismissed them or told me to be quiet. Her hand tightened on his. Those things are not nothing, Silas. They are everything. He wanted to kiss her. The desire rose up in him so strongly that it took all his considerable willpower to resist. But she was vulnerable, worried about her sister, and dependent on him for survival. He would not take advantage of that, no matter how much he wanted to close the small distance between them and taste her lips. Instead, he lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then I will stay, he promised. We will get you to your sister, and I will stay. And we will see what comes of this strange gift the storm has given us. Her smile was radiant, chasing away the last shadows of worry from her face. Thank you, she breathed. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, hands still entwined, until exhaustion finally claimed them both and they retreated to their separate sleeping arrangements for the last time. The morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed almost painful in its intensity after days of gray storm clouds. Silas was up before first light, preparing the horse and the travois, packing supplies and ensuring everything was secured properly. Tabitha emerged from the cabin dressed in her traveling clothes, which he had hung to dry, and which were now serviceable, if not entirely appropriate for mountain winter travel. Ready, he asked, and she nodded, though he could see the anxiety building in her again now that they were finally going to attempt the journey. He helped her settle into the travois, arranging the furs around her to maximize warmth. The horse seemed rested and eager to move after days confined to the lean-to. Silas took up the lead rope and gave his cabin one last look, wondering what he would find when he returned and if he would return alone. Then he turned his face toward Lone Pine and began to walk. The journey was difficult but not impossible. The snow was deep, but Silas knew the terrain well enough to find the path of least resistance. The horse proved sure-footed and steady, and Tabitha bore the cold and the tedium with remarkable fortitude. They stopped twice to rest and share water and dried meat, and each time Silas checked on her carefully, ensuring she was not getting too cold or too fatigued. "How much farther?" she asked during their second stop, her breath pluming white in the frigid air. "Perhaps 5 more miles, Silas estimated, squinting at the angle of the sun. "We should reach town well before dark." Lone Pine, when it finally came into view, was a small settlement nestled in a valley between the mountains. It consisted of perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a main street, with a scattering of outlying cabins and homesteads visible in the surrounding landscape. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Silas could see people moving about despite the cold, going about the business of survival that defined frontier life. Tabitha sat up straighter in the travois, her eyes scanning the buildings urgently. "The sawmill is on the north edge of town," she said. "Thomas and Margaret live in a cabin just behind it." Silas guided them in that direction, aware of the curious stares they were attracting from the townspeople they passed. He supposed they made quite a sight, a mountain man leading a horse pulling a travois with a woman bundled in furs. People in small towns talked, and he knew this would be no exception. He could almost hear the speculation beginning already. The sawmill was quiet, its great blade still and silent under a blanket of snow. The cabin behind it was small but well-built, with a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. Silas brought the horse to a stop and helped Tabitha down from the travois. She was trembling, though whether from cold or emotion he could not tell. "Do you want me to wait here?" he asked quietly. She shook her head and grabbed his hand, holding it tightly. "Please come with me. I need you with me." Together they approached the cabin door. Tabitha knocked, and after a moment it swung open to reveal a young man with sandy hair and worried eyes. His face went slack with shock when he saw who stood on his doorstep. "Tabitha," he gasped. "Dear God, how did you? We thought you were dead." "The driver came back alone, said the sleigh had overturned and he had lost track of you in the storm. We sent men out searching, but the weather was too bad and we thought—" "I am alive," Tabitha said, her voice shaking. "I am alive because of this man." "But Thomas, how is Margaret?" "Please tell me she is alive," Thomas said quickly. And Tabitha nearly collapsed with relief. Silas steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "The fever broke yesterday morning. She is weak, but the doctor says she will recover." Tears were streaming down Tabitha's face now. Tears of pure relief and gratitude. "Can I see her?" "Of course, come in, come in." Thomas stepped back to allow them entry. The cabin's interior was warm and cozy, modestly furnished but clearly kept with care and affection. A doorway led to what was presumably the bedroom, and Tabitha moved toward it without hesitation. Margaret was indeed alive, propped up on pillows with her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She was pale and thin, clearly ravaged by whatever illness had gripped her, but her eyes were clear and alert. When she saw her sister, she let out a cry of joy and reached out with weak arms. "Tabitha, Thomas said you were coming, but then when the sleigh driver came back without you, we feared the worst." "Oh, thank God you are safe." The sisters embraced, both crying now, and Silas felt like an intruder on this intimate moment. He began to back toward the door, but Tabitha turned and caught his hand again. "Margaret, Thomas, this is Silas Preston. He saved my life. He heard my sleigh bells when I overturned in the storm and came out to find me. He sheltered me in his cabin for 3 days and then brought me here." She looked up at him with such warmth and gratitude that it made his throat tight. "I owe him everything." "Then we owe him everything," Margaret said, her voice hoarse but fervent. "Sir, how can we ever thank you?" "No thanks are necessary," Silas said gruffly. "Anyone would have done the same." "That is not true, and you know it," Tabitha said softly. "Not everyone would have heard those bells over the storm. Not everyone would have gone out into that weather to investigate. Not everyone would have taken in a stranger and cared for her so well." Thomas stepped forward and offered his hand, which Silas shook. "You have our eternal gratitude," the younger man said seriously. "Please, you must be exhausted from the journey. Let me show you to the guest room where you can rest. We have little, but what we have is yours for as long as you need it." "I do not want to intrude," Silas started, but Tabitha cut him off. "You promised you would stay," she reminded him, her green eyes holding his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "Please, Silas, stay." And so he stayed. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was both comfortable and strange. Silas took up residence in the small guest room that Thomas and Margaret offered, a space barely large enough for a bed and a chair, but infinitely more luxurious than his mountain cabin. The town of Lone Pine was adjusting to winter's grip, and there was plenty of work for a man with Silas's skills and strength. He found himself helping at the sawmill when it ran, assisting neighbors with repairs and heavy lifting, and generally making himself useful in the way that frontier communities valued. But the real center of his days became Tabitha. With Margaret recovering and needing rest, Tabitha had time to spend with him, and she seemed determined to show him every corner of Lone Pine and its surrounding area. They walked together through the snow-covered streets. She talked while he mostly listened, and slowly, carefully, they learned each other. He discovered that she had a sharp wit and a deep laugh that made something warm unfurl in his chest every time he heard it. She was well-read and thoughtful, with opinions on everything from politics to philosophy to the best way to make cornbread. She was stubborn when she believed she was right, but willing to listen to other perspectives. She was kind to everyone they encountered, from the elderly woman who ran the general store to the young children who played in the snow, and she seemed genuinely fascinated by him, by his stories of life on the mountain and his knowledge of the wilderness. She asked endless questions about tracking animals, about reading weather signs, about the names of birds and trees. She wanted to know about his family, about his childhood, about what had made him into the man he was. He found himself opening up to her in ways he had never opened up to anyone, sharing thoughts and feelings he had kept locked away for years. One week after their arrival in Lone Pine, they walked together to the edge of town where the valley opened up to reveal a sweeping view of the mountains. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, and the world felt impossibly beautiful and impossibly vast. "I understand why you live up there," Tabitha said softly, her breath misting in the cold air. "It is so beautiful it almost hurts to look at it." "It can be brutal," Silas reminded her. "You nearly died up there, but I did not die," she countered. "I was saved. And these past days, Silas, they have been among the happiest of my life. Is that strange to say, given that I have been worried sick about Margaret and everything has been so uncertain?" "If it is strange, then I feel the same strangeness," he admitted. He had been working up his courage for this conversation all day, and now that the moment was here, his heart was pounding like he was heading into battle. "Tabitha, I need to tell you something." She turned to face him fully, her expression open and curious. "What is it?" "I do not want to go back to the mountain alone," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I thought I wanted solitude, thought I needed it to survive. But you have shown me that what I really needed was the right person, someone who understands me, who does not expect me to be anything other than what I am. Someone who makes me want to be better, to be more, to be part of the world again instead of hiding from it." Her eyes had gone very wide, and he could not quite read the expression on her face. He pressed on, knowing that if he stopped now he would lose his nerve entirely. "I am not good with words, and I do not know how to say this properly. I know we have only known each other for less than 2 weeks, and that is not long enough by any reasonable standard. But Tabitha, I have fallen in love with you, completely, irreversibly in love, and I am asking if you might consider staying with me. Not in my mountain cabin necessarily, I know that is no life for a woman like you, but somewhere, somehow, building something together." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an eternity. Then suddenly Tabitha was laughing, tears streaming down her face, and she threw herself into his arms the way she had that night in the cabin. "Yes," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. "Yes, you impossible, wonderful man, I love you too. I have been trying to find the courage to tell you for days now, terrified that you would decide to go back to your mountain and leave me behind." Relief and joy flooded through him in equal measure. He pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "I am never leaving you behind," he promised. "Not ever." And then finally he kissed her. It was not a practiced kiss, not smooth or sophisticated, but it was honest and passionate and full of all the emotion he had been holding back. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his coat, and for a long moment the world narrowed to just the two of them and the connection that had sparked to life between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Tabitha was smiling so brightly that she seemed to glow from within. "Margaret is going to be insufferable about this," she said, laughing. "She has been telling me since the day you brought me here that she could see the way you looked at me." "How do I look at you?" Silas asked, genuinely curious. "Like I am the only person in the world," Tabitha said softly. "Like I matter more than anything." "You do," he said simply. "You matter more than anything." They walked back to town hand in hand, making plans in the giddy, excited way of people who have just discovered they share the same dreams. They talked about where they might settle, perhaps in Lone Pine, where Tabitha could be near her sister, or perhaps in one of the other small towns in the valley where Silas could use his skills as a trapper and hunter while still being part of a community. They talked about building a home together, about what their life might look like, about a future that suddenly seemed bright and full of possibility When they reached Thomas and Margaret's cabin, they found both of them sitting at the kitchen table waiting with ill-concealed excitement. One look at Tabitha's face told them everything they needed to know. Finally, Margaret exclaimed, though her voice was still weak. "I told you, Thomas. I told you it would happen." "You were right as always, my dear," Thomas said, grinning. He stood and shook Silas's hand enthusiastically. "Welcome to the family, Silas. I hope you know what you are getting into." "I am beginning to get an idea," Silas replied, but he was smiling as he said it. That evening, they all sat together around the small table and shared a meal that felt like a celebration. Margaret, though still recovering, was more animated than she had been since their arrival, delighted by the romance that had blossomed between her sister and the mountain man who had saved Tabitha's life. She insisted on hearing every detail of their time in the cabin, and Tabitha obliged, painting a picture of those 3 days that made them sound almost magical in retrospect. As the evening wore on and Margaret began to tire, Silas found himself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he had been alone on his mountain, convinced that solitude was his destiny and his preference. Now he was sitting in a warm cabin surrounded by people who were welcoming him into their family, planning a future with a woman he loved more than he had thought possible. The mountain had not released him gently. It had thrown a blizzard at him, hurled a woman in desperate need into his path, and forced him to confront everything he had been running from. And somehow, impossibly, that violence had resulted in this warmth, this love, this sense of belonging that he had not even known he was missing. "What are you thinking about?" Tabitha asked softly. She had come to stand beside him where he stood looking out the window into the darkness. "I am thinking that I owe that storm a debt of gratitude," he replied, putting his arm around her and pulling her close. "If it had not blown you off the road and into my life, I would still be up on that mountain, alone and convinced that was what I wanted." "The storm brought us together," Tabitha agreed, resting her head on his shoulder. "But it was your choice to come find me and my choice to trust you. The storm may have started our story, Silas, but we are the ones who get to write the rest of it." "Then let us write something worth remembering," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. The winter of 1876 was remembered in Lone Pine as one of the harshest in recent memory, but for Silas Preston and Tabitha Vaughn, it would always be the winter they found each other. They were married in early February in a simple ceremony at the town's small church, with Margaret serving as maid of honor despite still recovering her strength, and Thomas standing up as Silas's best man even though they had known each other for less than 2 months. The wedding was attended by nearly everyone in Lone Pine, curious about the mountain man who had come down from his isolated cabin and fallen in love with the schoolteacher who had nearly frozen to death in the pass. There was something about their story that captured people's imaginations, something romantic and improbable that spoke to the hardscrabble frontier community's belief in fate and second chances. After the wedding, Silas and Tabitha settled into a cabin on the edge of town that had belonged to a prospector who had gone further west seeking his fortune. It was small but solid, with good bones and plenty of potential. Silas spent the early spring months making improvements and repairs, his skilled hands transforming the rough structure into a real home while Tabitha worked on the interior, bringing warmth and beauty to rooms that had known only a bachelor's rough living. By the time the snow began to melt and the first green shoots of spring appeared, they had created something that felt truly theirs, a place that reflected both his practical strength and her eye for comfort and detail. Tabitha started teaching again, this time working with a handful of children in Lone Pine who needed education, holding classes in their small front room when the weather was bad and outside under the trees when it was fine. Silas found work that utilized his knowledge of the mountains and wilderness without requiring him to retreat back into total isolation. He guided hunting parties in season, trapped and sold pelts, and used his considerable strength to help with various projects around town. He was surprised to discover that he enjoyed being part of a community, that there was satisfaction in being someone people could rely on. But more than anything, he loved coming home every evening to Tabitha, to the life they were building together. They talked for hours over dinner, sharing the details of their days. They read together by lamplight, Tabitha introducing him to books he had never encountered during his rough frontier education. They made love with a passion that never seemed to diminish, discovering each other's bodies and hearts with equal dedication. Margaret's health continued to improve through the spring, and she became a frequent visitor to their cabin, often bringing Thomas along. The four of them formed a tight family unit, celebrating birthdays and holidays together, supporting each other through the challenges that frontier life inevitably brought. When Margaret announced in May that she was expecting a child, Tabitha wept with joy, thrilled at the prospect of becoming an aunt. As summer arrived and the mountains shed their snowy mantles, Silas took Tabitha up to his cabin to show her the place where he had lived in isolation for so long. They made the journey together on horseback, and when they arrived at the clearing where his rough home stood, Tabitha stood for a long moment just looking at it. "This is where you saved my life," she said quietly. "This is where everything changed." "Do you want to see inside?" Silas asked, suddenly nervous about showing her this part of his past. She nodded, and he opened the door to the cabin that now felt oddly small and rough compared to the home they had created together. Tabitha walked through the single room slowly, her fingers trailing over the table where they had shared meals, the hearth where she had recovered from her near freezing, the bed where she had slept while he kept watch by the fire. "It feels like a lifetime ago," she said finally, "but also like yesterday. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Silas replied, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "That feels true for all of it, the war, the years of isolation, everything before you. It is both distant and immediate." Tabitha turned in his arms to face him. "Do you miss it, this solitude?" "No," he answered honestly. "I thought I would, but I do not. What I was looking for here was peace, and I found a kind of peace in the simplicity and the silence. But what I have with you is something deeper, not just the absence of turmoil, but actual joy and contentment. I would choose that every time." They stayed at the cabin for 3 days, a sort of honeymoon that allowed them to be completely alone together in a way that was difficult in town where neighbors and responsibilities always beckoned. Silas showed Tabitha the mountains he loved, teaching her to track animals and identify plants, sharing with her all the knowledge he had accumulated during his years of isolation. She proved an eager student, unafraid of the wilderness but respectful of its power. On their last night before heading back to Lone Pine, they sat outside the cabin watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast sky. The night was cool but not cold, and the sounds of the forest surrounded them, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the sigh of wind through the pines. "Thank you for bringing me here," Tabitha said softly. "I needed to see this place to understand this part of you." "And now that you have seen it?" Silas asked. "Now I understand even better what a gift it was that you were willing to leave it for me," she replied, reaching for his hand. "You did not just save my life that night, Silas. You gave up your entire way of living to be with me." "It was not a sacrifice," he corrected gently. "It was a choice, and the easiest choice I have ever made. You did not take me away from something I needed. You showed me what I had been missing." They returned to Lone Pine the next day, and life continued its forward march through the seasons. Autumn came with its spectacular display of color, and Silas took every opportunity to walk with Tabitha through the golden-leaved landscape, marveling at how much more beautiful everything seemed when shared with someone you loved. They helped Margaret and Thomas prepare for the baby's arrival, Silas building a cradle from pine while Tabitha sewed tiny clothes. When Margaret went into labor on a cold November evening, Tabitha was there to help bring her nephew into the world. The baby was a healthy boy with his father's sandy hair, and they named him James. Silas felt something shift in his chest the first time he held the tiny, squirming bundle, of fierce protectiveness and a glimpse of a future that might include children of his own. As winter approached again, marking a full year since that fateful night when he had heard sleigh bells through the storm, Silas found himself reflecting on everything that had changed. A year ago he had been a man convinced that he needed nothing and no one, that he was complete in his isolation. Now he was a husband, a brother-in-law, an uncle, a valued member of a community. He had friends and responsibilities and a future that stretched out before him, full of possibility. On the anniversary of Tabitha's accident, they bundled up warmly and walked out to the place where he had found her overturned sleigh. The spot was unmarked now, just another curve in the mountain road, but it held tremendous significance for both of them. "Sometimes I try to imagine what would have happened if you had not heard those bells," Tabitha said, her breath misting in the cold air. "If you had been asleep, or if the wind had been blowing the wrong direction, or if you had convinced yourself you imagined it." "I prefer not to imagine that," Silas said, tightening his arm around her. "What matters is that I did hear them, and I did come find you, and now we are here together." "Do you believe in fate?" she asked, looking up at him with those green eyes that still had the power to make his heart race. "Do you think we were meant to find each other?" Silas considered the question seriously. "I believe in choices," he said finally. "The storm was random. Your sleigh overturning was an accident, and my cabin just happened to be within earshot. But everything after that, my decision to go out into the blizzard, your decision to trust me, our decision to explore what was growing between us, those were choices. We chose each other, Tabitha, and that feels more meaningful to me than fate." She smiled and rose up on her toes to kiss him, heedless of the cold or the fact that they were standing on a public road where anyone might see. "I choose you too," she whispered against his lips. "Today and every day." As winter deepened and the year drew to a close, Silas found himself looking forward to the future with an anticipation he had not felt in years. In January, Tabitha told him she was pregnant, and his joy was so profound that he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests. They would have a child in the autumn, a son or daughter who would be the living embodiment of the love that had grown from those desperate sleigh bells and one man's decision to brave a storm. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and spring, and Silas hovered over Tabitha with a protectiveness that she found both endearing and occasionally frustrating. He would not let her lift anything heavy, insisted she rest frequently, and worried constantly despite her reassurances that she was perfectly healthy. Margaret, who had gone through this less than a year before, found his anxiety hilarious and teased him mercilessly. "You would think no woman in history had ever had a baby before," she said one afternoon when Silas had refused to let Tabitha help carry firewood. "She is pregnant, not made of glass." "I nearly lost her once," Silas replied quietly. "I will not risk her again." Margaret's teasing softened to understanding. "You will not lose her," she promised. "Tabitha is strong, and you will both be wonderful parents." Their daughter was born in late September of 1877, arriving on a day when the aspens had turned brilliant gold and the air held the first crisp promise of autumn. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and when Silas finally held his daughter for the first time, he understood with perfect clarity why men went to war, why they built homes and worked themselves to exhaustion, why they made all the sacrifices that love demanded. This tiny person, with her shock of dark hair and her mother's delicate features, was the future made flesh. They named her Grace because that was what she represented, a grace they had neither earned nor expected but had received anyway. Grace Preston, born of a love that had started with sleigh bells in a blizzard and grown into something that would outlast mountains and storms and time itself. As Grace grew from infant to toddler, the Preston cabin rang with laughter and sometimes tears, with the chaos and joy that small children brought to every space they inhabited. Silas discovered reserves of patience he had not known he possessed, and Tabitha proved to be a natural mother, balancing affection with discipline in a way that made their daughter feel secure and loved. Margaret and Thomas's James was just over a year older than Grace, and the two cousins became inseparable as they grew, playing together while their parents visited and helped each other with the endless tasks that frontier life demanded. The two families had grown so close that it was hard to remember a time when they had not been woven together, when Silas had not been uncle to James and Thomas had not been uncle to Grace. When Grace was 3, Tabitha became pregnant again, and Silas's protectiveness kicked into high gear once more. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with Tabitha suffering from sickness that lasted well beyond the first few months. And Silas worried constantly despite the doctor's assurances that everything was progressing normally. Their son was born in the summer of 1880, a big, healthy baby with his father's dark eyes and powerful lungs that he exercised frequently. They named him Samuel, after Silas's father, who had died when Silas was young. Holding his son for the first time, Silas felt a circle completing, a sense that he was giving to this next generation what his own father had tried to give him before war and loss had intervened. The years flowed by with the gentle inevitability of a river finding its path to the sea. Grace started school under her mother's tutelage, proving to be quick and curious, always asking questions about everything she saw. Samuel was more physical, always climbing and exploring, keeping his parents constantly on their toes with his fearless approach to the world. Together they filled the Preston home with noise and mess and unconditional love. Silas continued to work as a guide and trapper, though as the years passed and Lone Pine grew, he found himself doing more carpentry and building work. He had a gift for it, and people trusted his skill and integrity. He and Thomas went into business together, offering their combined skills to a town that was expanding as more settlers arrived seeking opportunity in California's mountain valleys. Tabitha kept teaching, though as her children grew, she reduced her hours to focus more on them. She never regretted the choices that had brought her to Lone Pine, never looked back wistfully at her life in independence. She had everything she needed right here: a husband who loved her devotedly, children who brought her joy, a sister who was also her best friend, and a community that valued her contributions. Margaret and Thomas had 2 more children over the years, daughters who were doted on by their older brother James. The 6 cousins grew up more like siblings, constantly in and out of each other's homes, creating memories that would last their lifetimes. The two families celebrated every holiday together, marked every milestone as a unit, and supported each other through the losses and challenges that no life could avoid. When Grace turned 10, she asked her father to tell her the story of how he met her mother. They were sitting on the porch of their now expanded home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Samuel was inside with Tabitha, supposedly doing his lessons but more likely causing some kind of mischief, and it was one of those rare quiet moments that Silas had learned to treasure. "Your mother nearly died," he began, and Grace's eyes went wide. "There was a terrible storm, the worst I had seen in years. And I heard something bells, like the kind that hang on sleighs. I almost convinced myself I had imagined them, but something made me go out into that blizzard to investigate." "And you found Mama," Grace said, having heard pieces of this story before but never the full telling. "I found her sleigh overturned, buried in snow, and your mother unconscious from the cold. I carried her back to my cabin and spent 3 days making sure she did not freeze to death." He smiled at the memory. She was very stubborn, even then. As soon as she could stand, she insisted on helping me with chores instead of resting like she should have. "Did you know right away that you loved her?" Grace asked with the romantic curiosity of a young girl. Silas considered the question carefully, wanting to give his daughter an honest answer. "I knew there was something different about her, something that made me want to be near her, even though I had spent years avoiding people. But love? That grew over those 3 days and the weeks after. It grew from talking and learning each other, from seeing how brave she was and how kind, from realizing that when I thought about my future, I could not imagine it without her in it." "That is so romantic," Grace sighed. "Like something from a storybook." "It was also cold and frightening and uncertain," Silas added. "Real love is not just the exciting moments, Grace. It is also the choice to keep loving someone even when things are hard, even when you are tired or frustrated or scared. Your mother and I have had plenty of hard moments over the years. But we chose each other at the beginning, and we keep choosing each other every day. That is what makes it real." Grace was quiet for a moment, absorbing this wisdom. Then she said, "I want to find love like that someday. Like you and Mama have." "Then do not settle for anything less," Silas told her. "Wait for someone who makes you feel like you matter more than anything. Like you are being seen for exactly who you are. Wait for someone you can talk to for hours and never run out of things to say. Wait for someone who chooses you deliberately and consistently, not just in the beginning but forever." He pulled his daughter close, marveling at how quickly she was growing, how she already showed signs of the strong, capable woman she would become. She had her mother's green eyes and his dark hair, the best of both of them combined into something entirely her own. That evening, after the children were in bed, Silas found Tabitha sitting on their porch in the twilight, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling air. He settled beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. "Grace asked me to tell her how we met," Silas said eventually. "What did you tell her?" Tabitha asked, leaning into his warmth. "The truth, that I heard your bells through a storm and could not ignore them, even though every practical consideration said I should stay in my warm cabin, that finding you changed everything for me. That I chose you, and I keep choosing you every single day." Tabitha turned to look up at him, and even after all these years, those green eyes could still make his breath catch. "I keep choosing you too," she said softly. "Every morning when I wake up next to you, every evening when you come home, every moment in between. You are my greatest adventure, Silas Preston. You saved my life that night, but more than that, you gave me a life worth living." He kissed her then, tender and deep, a kiss that held 14 years of shared history and the promise of all the years still to come. When they finally pulled apart, Tabitha was smiling that secret smile that never failed to make his heart race. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about those bells," she said. "About how they led you to me through all that snow and wind and chaos. Sometimes I wonder if they knew somehow that you were out there waiting, that all I had to do was ring loudly enough and you would come find me." "I will always come find you," Silas promised. "No matter how loud the storm, no matter how far you are, I will always hear your bells and follow them home." They sat together on that porch until full darkness fell and the mountain air grew too cold to ignore. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. Behind them, their house was warm and full of sleeping children, evidence of a love that had grown from desperation and bells and one man's decision to brave a blizzard. The years continued to pass, gentle and sometimes hard, bringing both joy and sorrow as all years do. Grace grew into a beautiful, intelligent young woman who eventually married a good man from a neighboring town and had children of her own. Samuel became a skilled carpenter like his father, taking over more and more of the business as Silas's joints began to stiffen with age. Margaret and Thomas grew old alongside Silas and Tabitha, their bond as strong as blood, their shared history a treasure they all valued. When Silas was 55 and Tabitha was 47, they made one last journey up to his old mountain cabin. Their bodies were not as young as they once were, and the climb took longer than it had when they were newlyweds, but they were determined to see the place where their story had truly begun one more time. The cabin was still standing, weathered but sturdy, a testament to the quality of Silas's original construction. Inside, dust covered everything and mice had made nests in the corners, but the bones of the place were sound. They spent an afternoon cleaning and reminiscing, Tabitha pointing out where she had slept, where they had shared meals, where she had first realized she was falling in love with the rough mountain man who had saved her. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked as they prepared to leave. "Giving up teaching in a real school, living in a small frontier town instead of somewhere more civilized? You could have had an easier life." Tabitha laughed and took his weathered hand in hers. "Easier is not better," she said firmly. "I have had exactly the life I was meant to have. I have loved and been loved beyond measure. I have raised 2 beautiful children and watched them become good adults. I have had adventures and challenges and moments of pure joy that I could never have imagined in my independent schoolroom. No, Silas, I regret nothing." They locked the cabin door behind them and began the long walk back down the mountain. As they descended, Silas found himself reflecting on the strange mathematics of love, how one night, one decision, one willingness to follow bells through a storm had resulted in all of this. A marriage, children, grandchildren, a lifetime of memories and experiences that would never have existed if he had convinced himself that the sound was just wind, just imagination, nothing worth braving the cold. That evening, back in their home in Lone Pine, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had gathered for Sunday dinner, Silas looked around the crowded table and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what he had been running from when he fled to his mountain connection, obligation, the vulnerability that came with loving people who could be lost. But what he had not understood then was that the pain of potential loss was worth it for the joy of actual love. Tabitha caught his eye across the table and smiled, and he knew she was thinking the same thing. They had built something remarkable from nothing, had created a family and a legacy from a single night of bells and snow. Whatever came next, whether they had years or decades remaining, they had already won. They had already found everything that mattered. As winter approached once more, Silas would sometimes stand at his window and listen to the wind howl through the valley, remembering that long-ago storm that had changed everything. He never heard sleigh bells anymore, had not heard them since that fateful night, but he remembered them perfectly, the desperate jingle that had cut through chaos and led him to his future. On quiet nights, when Tabitha was asleep beside him and the house was still, Silas would think about the man he had been isolated, convinced of his self-sufficiency, certain that he needed nothing from anyone. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. The mountain had broken him in the war, had offered him refuge in the years after, but it was Tabitha who had truly saved him, not from freezing or starving, but from a loneliness so complete he had not even recognized it as suffering. And in saving him, she had given him everything: purpose, family, joy, the understanding that strength was not about standing alone, but about being brave enough to stand with someone else. Every day with her had been a gift, every moment with their children and grandchildren a blessing he had not known to ask for. The bells had led him out into the storm, but Tabitha had led him back into life, and that Silas understood as he drifted towards sleep with his wife's hand in his, was the real miracle. Not that he had heard her bells over the wind, but that he had been brave enough to follow them, and that she had been brave enough to trust where they led. Their story was one of chance and choice, of danger and rescue, of 2 lonely people finding each other against all odds. But more than that, it was a story of love that endured through seasons and years, through challenges and changes, through every test that life could devise. It was a story that would be passed down through generations, told and retold until the details blurred into legend, but the heart of it would always remain true. On a winter night in 1876, a mountain man heard sleigh bells through a blizzard and followed them to find not just a woman in need, but the other half of his soul. And together they built a life that proved love was always worth the risk, always worth the leap of faith, always worth braving any storm. Silas and Tabitha Preston lived the rest of their days in Lone Pine, growing old together with the grace and dignity that came from having chosen each other fully and completely. They were fixtures in the community, respected and loved, known for their devotion to each other and their generous spirits. When they eventually passed Tabitha first, peacefully in her sleep at 73, and Silas following just 6 months later as if unable to bear being without her, the entire town mourned. But they also celebrated because the Prestons had shown them all what was possible when love was real and commitment was absolute. They had proved that even in the harsh frontier, even in a world that could be brutal and unforgiving, tenderness could thrive and devotion could endure. And on winter nights when the wind howled through the Sierra Nevada mountains, old-timers would sometimes tell the story of the mountain man and the school teacher, of sleigh bells that rang out through a blizzard, of a love that had started with desperation and grown into legend. They would tell it to their children and grandchildren, a reminder that sometimes the greatest loves came from the most unlikely circumstances, and that the choice to be brave, to follow bells into a storm, to trust a stranger, to risk your heart could change everything. The story lived on, passed down through generations of Prestons and through the collective memory of Lone Pine itself. It became part of the town's history, a tale that embodied the frontier's spirit of resilience and hope, and the belief that even in the darkest moments salvation might be just a sound away, if only you were brave enough to follow it home.